I see that some folks are dropping into the Zoom. We're going to start in a few minutes. Just hang on tight and we're excited to get started. All right, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Hinckley Institute. My name is Ian and I will be your forum host for today's conversation. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute here at the University of Utah. The Hinckley Institute provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing on local and national thought leaders. We want to thank the Climate Leadership Council, as well as Riverwood Strategies for their support in organizing this event. The Climate Leadership Council works with a broad set of stakeholders to promote the most effective, equitable, and politically viable climate solutions. Their bipartisan climate roadmap was developed in 2020 to outline the basis of the carbon dividend plans that lower carbon emissions, invests in all Americans in a clean energy future, and holds other countries accountable. The council is based in Washington, D.C., and I'll know that the Climate Leadership Council has been cited in many of my research papers, so I'm very personally excited to welcome them to the Hinckley Institute today. First, we will hear from Greg Bertelsen for his presentation titled A Climate Roadmap for a Conservative Climate Leadership. Mr. Bertelsen has served as CEO of the Climate Leadership Council since 2020. He joined the council in 2017, serving first as executive vice president, leading to the organization's government relations and engagement with the business community. Mr. Bertelsen previously served as senior director of energy and natural resources policy at the National Association of Manufacturers, where he led advocacy efforts on behalf of manufacturers for a variety of energy and environmental policy issues. He also served as a regulatory analyst, environmental markets and policy at Siemens AG, where he advised Fortune 100 industrial and utility companies on energy and environmental policy. In 2016 and 2017, he served as an official advisor on the Environmental Protection Agency on environmental justice issues. Mr. Bertelsen, I will turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Ian. Really appreciate you having me on. And for those also studying at the Hinckley Institute, really a pleasure to be speaking with you. And to those in the community, it's my pleasure to have this time to spend with you to share our work, our views on climate policy and addressing climate change more broadly. So as the name of our organization suggests, as the title of my presentation indicates, and as the headline for this event previews, today we're talking about climate change. And let me start by sharing our views on this issue and our big picture views on how this issue should be addressed. So let me start by saying we are, probably unsurprising to hear, an organization that believes climate change is real. We believe that man, through its industrial activity, is contributing to it, and that the United States, as the most advanced and largest economy, has a role in addressing it, and we need policy to do that. But we also believe that climate change, we also know that climate change is not the only challenge facing our country and facing the world. And addressing climate requires us to be considerate of those other challenges. We want to solve this issue in a way that ensures our economy remains strong, that our citizens have a path to a prosperous future, that our businesses remain competitive in a global economy. And we also need to address this issue in the United States in a way that reflects the global nature of the challenge. The US is a very large emitting nation in the world, but certainly not the only. And if we're going to solve this problem at the scale required, we need to find approaches that engage the entire world. We need to find approaches that hold other major emitting countries, other major emitting businesses in other countries accountable for their emissions. Now, the good news from my perspective is that climate change, while probably, or in my opinion, I would say, it is the greatest environmental challenge of any of our times, it is also infinitely solvable. We can address this challenge. We have the technologies already developed to address much of it, and we have the innovative capability as a country and as a species to solve the rest. What we need most are market signals. We need signals in the marketplace, rewards in the marketplace for more innovation and faster deployment of existing technologies. And policy is an essential part of it. Federal policy is an essential part of it. I'm going to just take a moment to share my screen. So you've likely heard about a lot of different types of climate policies out there. I've been working on this issue for nearly 2 decades and am of the opinion that never before has there been an environmental challenge for which the solution was so obvious. And I know that a lot of credit goes to a group of Republican elder statesmen who crafted the plan that we still work on today at the Climate Leadership Council, titled The Conservative Case for Carbon Dividends, which was co-authored in 2017 by, among others, former Secretaries of State Jim Baker and the late George Shultz. In fact, the plan that was outlined in this report and that we still promote today is often referred to as the Baker-Shultz carbon dividends plan. It rests on 4 interconnected pillars. The first and most important from a emission reducing standpoint is a gradually rising economy-wide fee on carbon, a gradually rising carbon fee. And for the economists or aspiring economists in the virtual room, you'll understand this concept quite easily. When we want less of something, we price it. When you put a price on something, when the price of things go up, in most cases, the demand for those things fall. In this case, the thing we want less of are carbon emissions. And so under the Baker-Shultz plan, we're simply assessing a fee on the amount of carbon emissions that will result from combusting fuels, and then allowing the marketplace to determine where those reductions come from. We're not saying you must use this technology or you can't use this fuel. We're simply saying that there's a cost to carbon emissions to our economy, to the world economy, and we're going to assess a fee based on that cost. And then we'll let market transactions find reductions along the way. And over time, year over year, the price for that carbon fee would increase. And with it, the incentive to find more innovative carbon neutral or lower carbon options would then increase. This is an approach that for about as long as we've known climate change was a scientific challenge, economists have agreed is the most efficient and effective way to address the issue. We helped organize what is still the largest statement in the history of the economics profession. Most economists ever to sign a single document. co-authored an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, 3,500 of them, endorsing this approach. 4 former Fed chairs, Nobel laureates, almost every living chief economic advisor to every president back to Nixon unanimously agreed that it is the most effective approach to this issue. The reason for that is that it works. It drives a reduction in emissions. And so what I'm sharing on this slide are 3 scenarios, if you will. The first gray line is business as usual, and this is before the Inflation Reduction Act passed last fall, which by most accounts is the most significant climate bill ever to pass the United States Congress. So the gray line is before that. And as you'll see, based on or measuring from 2005 emissions, expectations were we'd reduce emissions by about 22% by the year 2035. Just as a reference point, the Paris target, which was set under the Obama administration, was a 50% reduction. So that's the gray line. The blue line is an optimistic modeling assessment of what the Inflation Reduction Act, again, passed just last year, would achieve. A lot of news coverage around it still to this day. Again, most significant climate bill in history, and yet would only achieve about a 36% reduction in emissions. We modeled our carbon dividends plan actually before the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and consistent with other models we've seen, would reduce emissions by over 50%. And actually, as I'll show you a little bit later in the presentation, some models believe that that's a underestimate. But the point is economists, environmental leaders, businesses as well, support this approach first and foremost because it works. It works at addressing the underlying issue of reducing emissions. Now, if you're thinking through this and if you're familiar with the concept of a carbon fee, you understand that by design, we're sending a price signal through almost every economic transaction in the economy, which means that for some things, particularly really energy intensive things or large purchases of energy, there could be a substantial cost. What we don't want is for consumers, citizens to bear the financial brunt of this transaction. We want this transition. We want the price signal to come through, but we don't want to ask middle and low income families to shoulder the cost of the low carbon transition. And so the carbon dividends plan, authored by Baker and Schultz, return all the money back to American citizens. And what that means is that the average family of 4 would receive about $2,000 per year in dividend payments. So you can think of this like a Social Security payment or a number of other programs. But the difference is it's completely self-funded. So all of the money that comes in goes out to households, and the net impacts are beneficial for the majority of the country. And so we did a study with Oxford Economics in which they determined and measured and projected how families would do under this program financially based on where they were on the economic spectrum. And so the way to read this chart is in decile 1, those are the lowest earning 10% families. Decile 10 are the wealthiest, highest earning families. Any bar that's above the line, above 0, means that on average, families in that decile will net out ahead. We looked at it in the first year of the program and in the 5th year of the program. And as you'll see, somewhere in the neighborhood of the bottom 8 or 9 deciles net out ahead, meaning that at the end of the year, they will have more disposable income than they would have otherwise. The third pillar of our program is regulatory simplification. If you are a business or you talk to businesses or you study business, one thing you know is that certainty is king. And the beauty of this approach is I can tell you in a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what the program is going to be, because it's just going to be a price that's going to go on your spreadsheet and you're going to figure out how to run your business from there. Under the current approach, I can't tell you what the regulations are going to be in a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 7 years from now. And that inhibits informed investment. And so under our program, under the Baker-Schultz plan, we would propose simplifying regulations that would be duplicative with the very effective carbon price in place. And then finally, and this is a portion that spreads into something my colleague Katrina Rourke is going to talk about a little later, is a system of border carbon adjustments. I mentioned at the top of my remarks the importance of ensuring that our companies, United States companies, remain competitive throughout this transition to a lower carbon economy. The border carbon adjustment pillar would ensure that all companies, both in the domestic market and internationally, are playing on a level playing field. So put simply, goods coming into the country would pay the same fee as domestic companies, and exported goods manufactured in the United States would see a rebate. So again, in the United States, we'd all be playing on the same playing field with the carbon price in place. And externally, to the extent other countries haven't adopted similar programs, our companies will be playing on a level playing field there as well. We've done some modeling, some additional modeling on the economic impacts of this type of a program, and I'll just quickly run through the highlights. This chart is quite complex to read, but let me break out the highlights. $1.4 trillion in new technological innovation through 2035, the creation of up to $1.6 million jobs, which in this very moment in history may not seem like a big deal, but if we are entering a recession or something along those lines, we and politicians and others are going to care a lot more about what 1.6 million jobs would mean to Americans. It's going to create a competitive advantage for more efficient U.S. firms. Again, previewing a little bit about what Katrina will cover. Another beauty of this approach is it leverages our lead as a country in producing goods while emitting fewer carbon emissions. I mentioned earlier that some modeling projects an even greater amount of reductions. This model was just one of those models projecting a 57% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2035 and an increase in renewable energy output. We've been working with a number of companies and industry trade groups and others. And in 2020, we released this document, a bipartisan climate roadmap, which put more meat on the bones of the original 4-pillar plan. We worked with the entities that are described or shown on the right side of this slide. You'll notice a number of recognizable companies from sectors across the economy, individuals from a variety of political persuasions. So along with our distinguished Republican co-authors, we've been working with officials from Democratic administrations, both energy secretaries from the Obama administration, and a number of others. And for that reason, this remains the most promising, meaningful climate policy approach out there. And so I'm just sharing a few examples of U.S. senators from both the right and left who have stepped forward and are moving forward in support of an approach like this, or specifically this approach. And since I'm speaking with a group based in Utah, I thought I would highlight the first senator on this slide, Senator Romney, who, in my opinion, remains the most thoughtful public champion of this approach. As you all have been tracking in his now 4 years in the U.S. Senate, he has talked about the importance of addressing climate in a smart way quite a bit. And he often talks about the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends plan as an essential component of that. So always delighted to hear the senator from Utah talking about this approach. Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island, probably one of the biggest climate hawks in the Senate, has been a big supporter of this approach, and a number of others from both sides of the aisle. Now, while we view this as an approach that has a lot of promise for bipartisan support, to be clear, more work is needed. And this, I don't think, will come as a surprise for me to say, but when it comes to big climate action, in general, Republicans tend to be the more hesitant party to step forward. And so we have been watching with interest a bit of a shift in that trend, however. So recently, last fall, we did a polling exercise of not just Republican voters, but Republican voters who reliably vote. So like the voters who are most likely to turn out for a primary election, and ask them a number of questions, and I'll get to some of the other questions we asked in a moment. But one of the first questions we asked was, how important is it for Congress to address climate change? 54% of those voters who are most likely to vote in a primary said it was important. Now, that might seem like a small margin, but for that segment of the voting population, this is actually quite significant that we've passed the majority threshold. And what is driving that support most are young voters. So 54% of all, I believe they're titled high propensity Republican voters, believe it's important for their member of Congress to address climate change. That number jumps to 71% when you narrow the pool to 18 to 34-year-olds. So from 54% for all voters to 71% for young voters. That's substantial, and that's a trend line. Now, part of the reason Republicans have been so hesitant to step forward on climate is the way that the traditional environmental community has approached the issue and presented the issue. We've found that when you promote a solution like this and you present it as a way to hold other major emitting economies accountable, 80% support, penalizing high emitters like China and Russia, 79%, and rewarding more efficient US manufacturers, those who emit less carbon, 76%, you see broad support, strong support among Republicans. Now, interestingly, we also in this poll asked folks whether they believed in climate change to begin with, and we then narrowed in on these same themes and saw how those voters, the voters who don't believe climate change is real, felt about approaching climate in this way. And it was pretty impressive. Over 2/3 or around 2/3 of voters who don't believe in climate change agree that we need to hold major emitters accountable for their carbon emissions, penalize high carbon emitting countries like China and Russia, and reward more carbon efficient US manufacturers. So I see a lot of promise there. One other thing I'd love to highlight, and hopefully you guys are aware of this, Congressman John Curtis also of the Utah delegation. Last Congress started the Conservative Climate Caucus. First time ever a group of Republicans have come together to explore climate solutions. And it's been really encouraging to see the amount of participation he's gotten from his colleagues. I think he would tell you he's surprised at just how many have eagerly signed up. And even more encouraging from my standpoint, those who have joined the caucus have been rewarded politically. So in their primaries, caucus members went 62-5, and I can tell you the 5 that lost, climate was not part of those elections. All 62 of those who won their primaries were reelected in the general, so undefeated in the general, and those members increased their margin of victory by 10 points between 2020 and 2022. So this is a political winner for Republicans, and that is very important when we're looking to see more bipartisan engagement, and ultimately, for me, more bipartisan support for the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends plan. Ian, I blew way past my time limit. I apologize, but I will kick it back to you.
You are totally okay. That was great information there. Now that we're halfway through, we're going to hear from Katrina Rourke. She is the Senior Vice President for Policy and Research at the Climate Leadership Council and is the Executive Director of the Center for Climate and Trade. In her role at the council, she develops and the details of the Baker-Schultz carbon dividend policy proposal and manages the council's research program and supports its advocacy and outreach activities. Prior to joining the council, Mrs. Rourke founded the Energy and Environment Program at R Street Institute, a free market and limited government public policy organization where she served as Director for Energy Policy and a Senior Fellow. She also founded the Energy Program at the Center-Right American Action Forum, an economic, domestic, and fiscal policy think tank. As a legislative assistant to former U.S. Rep. Bob Inglis of South Carolina, Ms. Rourke developed the first Republican-sponsored carbon tax bill. She began her career as the Presidential Management Fellow with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. Katrina, the floor is yours.
Ian, thank you so much. I'm going to talk to you about the work that we do in our Center for Climate and Trade, which, as Greg was talking about, we're really focused on getting the market signals right. At the Center for Climate and Trade, we talk about getting the market signals right at a different point in the global economy, at international borders, on goods that we're trading internationally, to ensure that we're using an additional market signal to decarbonize the global economy. At the Center for Climate and Trade, we can focus on this sort of new tack, the border carbon adjustment in the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends plan, that is accessing these internationally traded goods. But the umbrella of policies that we talk about now when we talk about border carbon adjustments, it's expanding rapidly. Some ideas that have emerged so far: the European Union has introduced and will implement a carbon border adjustment mechanism that's going to be attached to their emissions trading system that they have domestically. It'll help them ratchet up their environmental ambition and protect incumbent domestic industries. That's one idea that's out there. The US is also negotiating with the European Union the terms of what they call the Global Arrangement for Sustainable Steel and Aluminum, which would allow, at the start, the US and the European Union to work together to ratchet down the emissions associated with trade in steel and aluminum products. We've also seen the G7 contemplate a climate club, which would use trade tools to allow cooperation between those allies on international decarbonization within the G7 and also with additional international partners. We've seen some legislative proposals proliferate. So when we say the term border carbon adjustment now, we mean a much broader basket of potential policies. Because those policies are so ill-defined, what I want to talk to you about now are the opportunities that we can unlock by introducing this market signal at international borders by pricing internationally traded goods. Without further ado, it starts with the environmental story, right? This is about addressing greenhouse gas emissions internationally. And so that starts with what we call the carbon loophole. All economic activity requires us to expend energy, and that usually results in carbon emissions. So to produce any good or service anywhere in the world requires carbon emissions. 25% of internationally produced carbon emissions are associated with goods that get traded over an international border. So if we're able to think about trade tools in our toolkit for addressing greenhouse gas emissions, we're accessing a full 25% of global emissions. Why do we call it the carbon loophole and not just internationally traded emissions? Well, there are some particulars to how international carbon flows work associated with international trade. Excuse me, I'm under the weather, bear with me. The vast majority of internationally traded carbon moves from countries with lower environmental ambition to higher environmental ambition. So the United States, a highly climate ambitious country, an extremely carbon efficient country, we import more emissions than we export. We are importing carbon flows from countries with lower environmental standards, with lower climate ambition than we have. The same goes for the European Union, the largest importer of carbon emissions in the world. The vast majority of trade is flowing from these low ambition countries to high ambition countries, which means we're importing more emissions than we would manufacture if we were producing those goods domestically instead of importing them. It means we can exact some pressure on international emissions if we deploy trade tools. The climate story is sort of complemented by an economic story. We call this the carbon advantage. I know this chart is overwhelming. Let me break it down for you. We've studied the relative carbon intensity of manufacturing goods across the economy in the US and in our partner countries. What I show you here are internationally traded goods broken down by sector, and USMCA, BRIC, European Union countries, and the world average. What you want to look out for is a red box. A red box means that manufacturing a good in that sector, in that country, requires more carbon emissions than it does in the United States. And we'll see if you scroll down to this bottom economy-wide statistic, to manufacture the average dollar value in China requires 3 times more emissions than if we manufactured that here at home. In India, in Russia, 4 times the amount of emissions to create the very same dollar value that we could create here at home, because we're a much more carbon efficient country. This is the sort of economic case for border carbon adjustments. Because we are cleaner manufacturers, introducing this market signal to benefit decarbonization would create a new point of value for our carbon efficient manufacturers here at home. This will be more clear if we break it down into individual industries, which I'll show you next. The US steel sector is really carbon efficient in comparison to the global average. American steel producers are the cleanest producers that sell into the US market. So what you see here is that same sort of carbon advantage statistic. To manufacture flats, think car doors, requires considerably more emissions to manufacture anywhere else in the world than it does in the United States. To manufacture longs, think rebar used for construction, requires as much as 700% more emissions to manufacture internationally. These are substitutable products. We're using much more carbon efficient systems to manufacture these goods. So if we imposed a policy like the Baker-Schultz carbon dividends plan that Greg was talking about, we could create new economic value for domestic manufacturers of steel. We could see sales for domestic manufacturers increase as much as 9%. Profits to the existing steel industry increase as much as 40%, and imports get cut in half simply by introducing a market signal linked to the carbon efficiency of domestic steel production. That's a pretty powerful incentive to start thinking about our trade toolkit as a climate toolkit, because it creates this competitive benefit as well. We continue to study additional sectors to identify this value for incumbent industries. The latest industry we studied was the bulk chemicals industry. Again, we're creating entirely identical substitutable products with far fewer emissions than our international partners, and we have no reward system as yet to create an economic benefit from this carbon advantage. That's what we're talking about unlocking here. There's also a really terrific opportunity in this climate and trade toolkit to cooperate more closely with international partners that are aligned with us on climate and other core values. I mentioned earlier that the G7 is thinking about this climate club concept, working together towards a climate club. So let's take them as a case study. If we're able to mobilize the G7 towards a similar set of climate and trade tools, then we're going to mobilize more than half of the global consumer economy to creating incentives to lower the emissions associated with traded products. That's a huge potential impact that we're leaving on the table, leveraging more than half the economy towards decarbonization. That kind of climate accountability just does not exist in the present marketplace. At the same time that we're introducing this system of accountability, charging importers for their higher emissions, We're also creating the opportunity to collaborate more closely with these partners to increase the volume of trade in lower carbon products, but also in products consistent with decarbonization. So we can get US innovated product out into the global marketplace. Yes, to our partners in the G7, but also into emerging markets that we want to deal with more closely, helping them decarbonize at the same time that we're benefiting US innovators. And that's a really powerful opportunity for us. So if the G7 is able to ensure that imports match domestic carbon intensity, if we're able to collectively leverage our carbon advantages, we could cut global emissions 1.8 billion tons per year. That's 5% of global carbon emissions just by accessing trade tools, let alone what we can do domestically now that we've leveled the playing field with importers. And a final really interesting opportunity is this geopolitical opportunity. So you'll notice China and Russia, outliers in carbon intensity. They are extraordinarily carbon inefficient economies. They also use their export markets to execute leverage on the international stage. As we've seen with Russia, they wanted to use their dominance in the European energy market, sort of mute European opposition to their invasion of Ukraine. Didn't pan out the way that they had intended, but they're using their export economies as a weapon. China is doing something similar. They have a stranglehold on a lot of key export markets, and they use that for geopolitical leverage in other arenas. If we're introducing these tools, we're executing this new kind of pressure on those economies where we're deleveraging them on the international stage simply because of their contributions to the climate problem. Here we have a quote from Russia's oil czar. He, in advance of the invasion of Ukraine, was thinking about the Europeans' effort on the carbon border adjustment mechanism that would charge imports to the European Union for their carbon intensity. And he noted that that policy would cause incomparably greater damage to the Russian economy than sanctions. Sanctions intended to cause damage to the Russian economy. They have this perception that they are dirtier and they're concerned about what these policies can do. That's a whole lot of leverage. China has studied the CBAM. They identified that the CBAM could shrink the Chinese economy 1 to 2% simply by charging Chinese imports to the European Union for their carbon emissions. Again, a whole lot of leverage that we're leaving on the table. And geopolitical strategists in the US notice this. Former National Security Advisor under Trump, General H.R. McMaster, noted the potential of this toolkit to execute the kind of pressure we need on those geopolitical rivals and improve our own energy resiliency so that we're sort of taking away the power of these authoritarian rivals to execute any coercive power over the US economy and partner countries, a really powerful tool in our toolbox that we haven't yet tapped. And then finally, a familiar face, Senator Romney has noted the capacity of these climate and trade tools of carbon pricing with a border carbon adjustment to execute that same kind of pressure on China and create the right kind of incentives for China to reorient towards decarbonization at the same time that we can deleverage the power they have in the US market. So huge potential from this policy toolkit. That's why we're seeing the proliferation of ideas in this space, and that's why we're studying it at the Center for Climate and Trade. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. As I mentioned in the chat, we're going to take a few questions. Feel free to raise your hand using the React function. And while some of you are doing that, I'm going to read a question that was given to me in the chat. And apologies, we aren't going to be able to get to all the questions. I've been flooded with plenty, which is great. Love to see it. So first question is from Derek. What alternative employment opportunities will be given or made for those who lose their job as a result of the Baker-Schultz plan? And Katrina and Greg, either of you can answer it.
I'll happy to go first. So one of the reasons we're so supportive of this approach, and just to highlight my background, I started my career working with manufacturers, many of them in heavy industries, is that under this approach, we are not simply talking about creating jobs for renewable technologies or the new green, sort of the more traditionally thought of green economy. We're talking about creating more jobs for incumbent industries, for incumbent workers in industries like steel and aluminum and chemicals. We're saying that part of the climate solution strategy will be to increase manufacturing in those industries because of what Katrina just talked about, because we're more carbon efficient. That's part of the strategy. More investment, more jobs in those industries as a climate solution. Now, I can't sit here and tell you that every sector is going to be a winner and no sectors are going to have to transition or create new technologies. But on balance, we're going to see a tremendous increase in job opportunities. Again, not just in renewables, which we'll see, and in new low carbon technologies, what we'll see, but also in heavy incumbent industries like steel, aluminum, and chemicals.
All right, next we're going to hear from Tyler. He is raising his hand in the chat. And Tyler, I just sent you permission to unmute.
All right, so can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I appreciate the presentations, were very informative. So my question is along those same lines, because energy production or a whole bunch of production in manufacturing would be more expensive in countries that are less concerned about carbon emissions, such as India, Russia, or China. And obviously some of those people would potentially lose their jobs in those sectors, while also, as they transition to more clean ways to produce different goods. I think there is some data that suggests that as people become more poor, they care less about the environment. If you're concerned about, getting your next meal, you're not concerned about cutting down the trees next to your house to providing fire to cook your food. So how do we balance potentially sending some people into poverty in these countries with reducing emissions? Because obviously we want people to become more wealthy so they can be more concerned about the environment. But I'm not sure how that happens if energy or steel production goes up in countries like India or China.
And then Greg, Katrina, either of you can take that one if you'd like.
Thanks for the question, Tyler. I wasn't as clear as I could have been when I talked about the opportunities for cooperation here. So let me take a step back. The purpose of these climate and trade policies that we're discussing is to build stronger trade bonds centered around decarbonization. Those stronger trade bonds will continue to create additional economic opportunities in emerging markets. So it's entirely consistent with promoting more development, creating more economic opportunity in emerging markets if we're leveraging these climate and trade tools appropriately. It's not just about climate accountability for the goods that come into the US market. It's about increasing trade and increasing access to technologies consistent with decarbonization on an international front. So it's a whole part of what we hear about encouraging development and decarbonization simultaneously is sort of locked in on that trajectory precisely. So we're not talking about a policy that'll increase poverty internationally. We're talking about policies that'll elevate the global economy consistent with decarbonization over the long term and enriching emerging markets by increasing trade with the United States consistent with our decarbonization objectives.
Perfect. Thank you. And then next question is from the chat, is from Grayson. And he asks, as more funding, public and private, goes to domestic clean energy and manufacturing projects, how would those investments be affected by a border carbon adjustment? And then again, right, Katrina, either of you can take that question if you'd like.
Sure, I can go. Katrina, I know your time is limited. But so on a few levels. So first, the more carbon efficient we become as an economy, the greater our carbon efficient advantage will become. And with these types of policies in place, the greater the economic reward once in place. Now, there's another part of this answer, which perhaps wasn't, Grayson, in your question, but it's relevant to the current policy discussion around the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the requirements in that law that restrict sourcing from certain countries, from countries in which we have free trade agreements. And if you've been tracking the issue, you'll be familiar with some of our allies becoming concerned and upset with this approach, feeling as though they'll be locked out of some of these opportunities. And without sort of speaking to that directly, an advantage of this approach is it creates an opportunity, to Katrina's point, for cooperation with countries like the EU. And it does so in a way that, in practice, is really a market approach. What we're saying is not that you can't use this fuel or you can't accept this technology from this country. What we're saying is that we're going to have carbon emissions be a factor among others in determining what supplies demand. And that's the beauty of the Baker-Schultz plan. It's the beauty of the policies that Katrina is exploring at the Center for Climate and Trade. It's that we're doing this in a way that corrects really an inefficiency in the market, which is a failure to account for carbon emissions by putting a price on it, either in the US economy or international borders. And then we're letting the market work and figure out where things are sourced from. And under that approach, you can find much more opportunities for cooperation, and while doing so, promote more efficient companies around the world who just so happen to operate in the United States by and large.
Perfect. Thank you. And then Benjamin, who is raising his hand, I'm going to unmute you and allow you to ask your question.
Alrighty. Thank you very much. And Greg, thank you for joining us. I really enjoyed your presentation. I am most interested in the conversations that are actually happening sort of within the United States and looking at national communication and cooperation. I believe it was your presentation that I saw BP on the list of supporters of one of the larger sort of climate trajectory plans. And I'm wondering what sort of conversations we're having within the industry to get people like this on board. Is it an issue of, preserving the petroleum industry to keep diesel around sort of in smaller quantities for longer? Is it looking at shifting them towards renewables and biofuels? Or is it sort of a spectrum that goes on with time?
Great question. So what's interesting for me, working in Washington, D.C. with companies from industries across the economy, is that each industry and often each company within each industry has a different suite of climate policies that they support, and probably within climate policies, some that they don't support. But there is this sort of, like, if you're thinking of concentric circles of industries around the economy, there is one approach that tends to be supported by almost every sector, and that's a price on carbon. And the reason for that is these companies aren't afraid of competition. This is how they thrive. This is how they run their business. They compete every day. What they don't want is uncertainty. They don't want rules that arbitrarily, in their view, favor one industry over another, one technology over another. With a carbon price, we're establishing one common opponent, which is carbon emissions. Everybody's paying the same carbon price. Everybody has the same opportunity to look ahead, to invest in new business lines and new capital equipment, and everybody has an opportunity in the long run to win. And so what we found working with the companies that we've worked with, but also more broadly, is that this approach is really catching on across sectors. So just as a couple of examples, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the biggest business industry association in the country, has come out in support of a carbon price. The American Petroleum Institute, the association representing oil and gas producers, have endorsed the carbon price. The Railroad Association, consumer products companies across the board. And that's because, again, companies at the end of the day operate in spreadsheets. They want to know what things are going to cost, what the rules are going to be, and they figure out how to operate their business around it. And so for that reason, this approach has really united the business community.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much for that question. Then another question we have received in the chat is the reason we import the reason we import products from emission-heavy countries is because they're cheaper. Won't this raise prices? And they also added on another question: how are you defending the value of this policy in a time of high inflation?
It's a great question. So when we're talking about climate policy, you have to start with a threshold question. Is this an issue that we should address? And if the answer is yes, then the question becomes, does government policy have a role? My answer to both those questions is yes. This is an issue that is largely created by man, but it's also one that can be solved by man, and we have a duty to do so. And government policy is the appropriate venue. It's the only venue that we're going to find a solution. And so if you're in my space, if you're not in my space, we're having a different conversation. But if you're with me so far, then the question becomes as opposed to what? And I'll have you think back or look back to the comments I made earlier about the support among the economics community. Along with their support being driven by its effectiveness, economists support it because it's the most economically efficient way to do it. The other options we have outside of a market-based approach like price on carbon are the regulatory approach, which is the government coming in and telling businesses how they have to operate. And I can assure you that those costs will be substantially higher than a price on carbon. And I can assure you that those prices will be passed through to consumers. And then the other option is to use government subsidies, which, if we think through the whole process, are taxpayer funded. And as we all know, we are currently operating at a major deficit. And with that major deficit and debt comes interest payments, which are going to be paid by all of us who are hoping to be around for a while and less enthusiastically, but still paying taxes. And that comes with a cost too. And so when compared to the other approaches, this is by far the lowest cost approach. It also generates revenue, which under our proposal will be returned to the American public. And as I shared earlier, the net impacts ends up being beneficial for most Americans. And so to your question, this ends up being the least inflationary approach. In fact, we've seen some modeling which suggests that over the long term, a carbon price is deflationary. And it has the added advantage to be coupled with the opportunity to return money directly back to citizens in the form of a rebate, which ensures that the vast majority of families are netting out neutral or even ahead.
All right, perfect. And we have time for one or two more questions. So if you have a question, drop it in the chat and we might have a chance to get to it. But a question we got from Michael is, what would the anticipated short-term economic shocks be from adding a carbon tariff to world trade?
So we've done quite a bit of modeling around this. And again, we don't view this issue in isolation from others. And we support this approach because at the end of the day, it is based on going after, on our attacking our enemy is carbon emissions. So the border adjustment policies that we've been discussing, either through the Baker-Schultz plan or the expanded work that Katrina has been doing, is as opposed to an economic tariff, which can be somewhat arbitrary in how it's applied and in what amounts, is based on carbon emissions. So we're not restricting the flow of trade. In fact, we're promoting more free-flowing trade as opposed to sort of arbitrary tariff approaches. This is based on carbon intensity, not based on an economic outcome, or not driven by an economic outcome. Now, the result of this policy, the result of penalizing higher carbon emitting goods, encouraging lower carbon emitting goods, will be on average beneficial for US businesses because of the investments many have made already to become more carbon efficient. So the objective of the policy is to create incentives for lower carbon emissions globally. The impact ends up being a beneficial one for the US economy.
Okay, that's probably all the time we have for questions. So I'm really sorry if we didn't get to yours. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I also want to give a special thanks to Mr. Bertelsen and Mrs. Rourke for joining us and the entire team at the Climate Leadership Council. It's been a really great forum. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming.